The year is 1864. The world outside the palace walls is changing. Steam rises from the factories.
The British Empire's power grows, and the era of the grand aristocracy is nearing its twilight.
Yet within these walls, an insidious force drives a force that does not bend to the laws of time or reason. Here, in the heart of the palace, a dark magic stirs. Lady Beatrice Hollingsworth, a woman of unmatched beauty and wealth, was more than just a noblewoman.
She was a force of nature, commanding the respect of those around her and inciting fear in others. To those who knew her best, however, she was a woman of hidden depths, capable of both exquisite charm and ruthless calculation. Beatrice had spent her life battling for power in a world where women were meant to remain silent.
Yet, despite her sharp intellect, despite her unmatched beauty, it wasn't enough.
Others had to fall, others had to suffer,
And so, she turned to something far more potent than mere political maneuvering. Voodoo, dark magic, the ancient power that had crossed oceans from the Caribbean and whispered its promises of revenge in the dark corners of the British aristocracy.
But what led Lady Beatrice to this path? A feud, decades in the making.
A rivalry between her and Lady Isabella Graves, a socialite of equal standing and equally ruthless ambition. It began with a slight and minor insult during their first meeting.
A look,
A word, that was enough to set the wheels of fate in motion. And so, a plan was hatched. A plan that would destroy those who dared to cross Beatrice. It would be subtle, elegant, a whispered promise of vengeance wrapped in the threads of fate.
Beatrice would curse them,
She would curse them with the very fabric of their being.
but her weapon was not a sword.
It was not poison or a dagger. Her weapon was far more dangerous.
She would use something far darker. Voodoo dolls. Voodoo dolls were not new to the Victorian elite, but they had always been seen as mere superstitions. But what if one could make them real?
What if the dolls were more than just dolls?
What if they could control fate itself?
Lady Beatrice Hollingsworth would soon find out. The winds of fate were already turning.
In the grand palace of Hollingsworth Manor, Beatrice watched, silent and calculating, as her rivals continued to dance around her in their game of social gamesmanship. Their laughter, their shallow flattery, it all repulsed her. They thought her weak.
They thought her too delicate, too focused on her appearance to be of any true consequence.
They were wrong.
Lady Isabella Graves had long been Beatrice's most formidable adversary. Their rivalry was infamous, and it had become a legend whispered in the corners of every ballroom, every parlor. The two women were like fire and ice opposites in every way, yet bound by an unbreakable thread of competition. Both had eyes on the same prize, power, but only one would rise to claim it.
It was in the opulent drawing room of the Hollingsworth estate that the seed of Beatrice's dark ambition was planted. A small, secluded corner of the room where the dim light of candles barely touched the shadows.
That evening, Beatrice received a letter from Lady Isabella.
It was, on the surface, an invitation to tea, but beneath the surface there was something else.
A challenge, a public humiliation waiting to unfold.
The words were laced with a venomous sweetness. I hope to see you at the upcoming gala, Lady Beatrice. I have a most delightful surprise prepared.
One I'm certain will amuse you. The letter's final line was a dagger to her pride. I do hope you are still fit to attend, though I hear the weight of scandal can be most unforgiving. That was it. The line that broke Beatrice. The insult that marked the point of no return. She tore the letter into pieces, watching as they fluttered to the floor like the discarded remnants of her dignity. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with an icy resolve. A thought crossed her mind, one that had been festering beneath her calm demeanor for months. If I cannot be the jewel of the court, then I will destroy all that dare threaten my crown. She knew where to turn for power.
The dark whispers that had long circled the man voice of a woman in New Orleans who could control fate with nothing more than the twist of a needle, the pull of a string.
It was in that moment that Beatrice made her decision.
She would not confront Isabella head-on. She would not challenge her in public. Instead, she would wait, and when the time was right, she would strike quietly, precisely, and with deadly intent. Late that evening, Beatrice retired to her private chambers. The moonlight outside shone pale through the ornate windows, casting long, eerie shadows across the room.
She walked to the far corner,
where a small wooden box rested, its surface covered in intricate carvings.
The box contained the tools of her craft.
The dark, forbidden craft. She opened it carefully, her fingers trembling as she traced the edge of the contents. A small bundle of black threads, a vial of oil, and the doll herself delicate, crafted the image of her rival. The ritual would be long, complicated,
but it was nothing Beatrice feared.
She would begin the curse at dawn.
The dawn arrived slowly, as if reluctant to break the night's heavy silence.
Beatrice stood by the window, watching the first rays of sunlight creep across the velvet curtains.
The world outside was still, the only sound the distant rustling of leaves.
But within her, something stirred a dark anticipation that made her heart beat faster than the quiet morning air. The doll.
It was more than just an effigy,
more than a mere representation of Lady Isabella. Beatrice had not only crafted with meticulous care, but had infused it with intent, with a will to harm. She had studied the ancient rites in secret, seeking guidance from forbidden sources. The craft was delicate to delicate for the hands of any ordinary person.
But Beatrice was no ordinary woman. She ran her fingers along the edges of the doll's graft-stitched face.
Each thread was a symbol. Each knot was a binding to fate.
She had not just made a doll. She had created a conduit, a vessel for her anger, a vessel for her power.
With the rituals of the old world in her mind, Beatrice began her work.
The room was still, save for the occasional hiss of the candles.
The faint scent of incense filled the air, blending with the scent of lavender and dust. Beatrice took the black thread and began to wind it around the doll's lips, muttering incantations under her breath. Each turn of the thread was a whisper to the winds of fate. She could feel the power rising in the room, filling it with an energy she had never before dared to harness.
She placed the doll onto the velvet altar that she had crafted for the ritual.
The atmosphere grew dense, suffocating. The air seemed to hold its breath. Beatrice could hear nothing but the pounding of her own heart. And then the stillness broke.
A faint tug,
a pull at the edges of her consciousness.
Something was answering.
The doll was alive with magic, its form shifting ever so slightly, as though it were aware of its purpose. Beatrice could feel the shift, the subtle rise of dark energy.
The curse was not just an idea anymore, it was a living, breathing force. It would take her rival, piece by piece, without mercy, as she continued the ritual. The vision of Lady Isabella in her mind began to fade.
Beatrice saw only shadows, no longer the graceful, proud woman she had once envied, but a figure consumed by weakness, her body racked with pain. A smile curled on Beatrice's lips.
The first thread had been cast. The first link in the chain of vengeance was forged, but something lingered. A presence at the edge of her awareness, a flicker of doubt.
It would pass. The power was hers now. Beatrice reached for the vial of oil.
The final stage of the ritual was at hand as she poured the oil onto the doll. Its body seemed to twitch. The scent of the oil was pungent, sharp like the decay of something long dead.
The magic would not fail her. It could not. Beatrice closed her eyes and pressed the doll's tiny, fragile form against her own pulse.
Her breath quickened as she spoke the final incantation. The words felt like fire on her tongue, burning with intensity.
And then, as though summoned by her will, the spell was complete. The doll was no longer just a doll. It was a weapon, a harbinger of the end for Isabella Graves. Days passed, each one carrying a weight, an ominous quiet that fell over the palace like a shroud. Beatrice kept herself busy with the usual duties of the court, attending balls, hosting teas, and maintaining the image of the perfect aristocrat.
But behind the facade, her mind was always on one thing. The doll, Lady Isabella, was unaware.
She remained blissfully ignorant of the magic that hung over her life like a storm cloud, ready to strike. But the first signs began to appear on the third night after the ritual.
A letter arrived for Beatrice, delivered with trembling hands by her most trusted servant.
It was from Lady Isabella. Dearest Beatrice, the letter began, though the words felt false.
I trust you've enjoyed your recent social engagements. I do hope your health remains as brilliant as ever, as I am certain the gala we shall attend will require nothing less than your finest appearance.
However, I must apologize for a recent misfortune. I am afraid I am suffering from a sudden malaise, a pain that seems to prick my body, my very bones, though I can find no reason for it.
I suspect it is the result of a lingering chill, or perhaps the stress of these times.
Do let me know if you have any remedies to suggest.
Yours truly, Isabella Graves. The words were polite, proper, but Beatrice knew better.
The malady Isabella described was at the first sign. The curse was beginning to take root. Beatrice read the letter again, savoring the taste of her success. But there was a hint of something else, to a chill running down her spine.
Was the magic working as she had intended?
She closed the letter and set it aside, her eyes never leaving the smooth paper as if it held some deeper secret.
But she could not help the strange unease that had settled in her chest.
This was just the beginning, she told herself. By the following week, the whispers began to grow.
Isabella, once a figure of strength and poise, began to fade from the social scene.
First, it was the missed appearances, then the rumors.
Her once gleaming complexion had taken on a pallor, her movements slow and unsteady.
People noticed. They spoke in hushed tones behind closed doors.
Her suffering was becoming the talk of the court.
But it wasn't just Isabella's physical health that was deteriorating.
There were whispers of something dark or something worse. Servants spoke of hearing strange sounds in the night, of feeling watched when there was no one there.
Several of Isabella's closest confidants claimed they'd witnessed her having moments of wild, uncontrollable rage.
It was as if she were losing control of herself, as if something outside of her was taking hold.
And then, one evening, at a grand ball hosted by Beatrice herself, the inevitable occurred. Isabella collapsed.
The room fell into stunned silence as the lady of the hour crumpled to the floor, her body racked with tremors, her face twisted in agony, her eyes wide with terror. It was as though the very life was being drained from her, each breath coming harder than the last. Doctors were summoned, but they found nothing. No physical ailment, no explanation. They chalked it up to exhaustion, to stress. But Beatrice knew better.
The doll had begun its work, but something else was stirring too.
Something that made Beatrice uneasy.
There was a price to be paid for such power, and she feared it was coming due. The days after Isabella's collapse were a haze for the court. The whispers had grown into rumors, the rumors into something closer to dread. It was no longer a matter of illness.
The once proud lady had become a shadow of herself, her body trembling as if it were held together only by the thinnest threads of life.
The servants no longer dared to speak her name aloud, and those who had once flocked to her side now avoided her like the plague. Beatrice watched from the sidelines with a quiet satisfaction, her eyes glittering with a predatory glee.
Yet, beneath the surface of her triumph, there was something else, a creeping unease, a coldness that gnawed at her insides.
She had been careful. She had followed every step of the ritual. The curse was meant to be controlled. Precise, nothing could go wrong. But the signs were growing harder to ignore. There were subtle shifts in the air, as though the world around her was not quite right. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch longer, lingering in the dark, even as the candles burned bright, and sometimes, late at night, Beatrice would hear soft, unsettling whispers low, and almost inaudible like a voice carried on the wind, murmuring just beyond the threshold of her consciousness.
She dismissed them at first.
It was nothing, she told herself. The cost of power was simply the weight of one's own conscience.
Yet the whispers grew louder with each passing day. A feeling of being watched, of being followed, of something or someone hovering just beyond her reach.
Beatrice's sleep became restless, plagued by nightmares. Dark figures, shadowy shapes moved through the corridors of her mind. Their faces indistinct, their eyes hollow.
They whispered her name, their voices distorted and hollow.
And always there was the figure of Lady Isabella, her face twisted with anguish, her hands outstretched toward Beatrice as though reaching for something.
The curse had claimed Isabella's body, but had it claimed her soul as well? As the days wore on, Lady Isabella's condition worsened. It was not just her health that had begun to fail, her very essence seemed to be slipping away. Her skin grew pale and cold, her eyes sunken and glassy.
The sharpness that had once defined her biting wit, her fire was fading. She became a shell of her former self, her once commanding presence now reduced to a quivering shadow. Beatrice could no longer take pleasure in her rival's suffering.
In fact, the sense of triumph that had once filled her chest was slowly replaced by an unfamiliar emptiness. Was this truly what she had sought?
To reduce a woman of power to a wraith, what had she gained from this victory? Other than the loss of something that had once been her equal, the grand halls of Hollingsworth Manor, which had once been filled with life, were now haunted with silence.
The laughter of the court had turned to hushed tones of pity and fear.
Isabella had not been the only one who had fallen ill. Several others women who had once stood at Beatrice's side began to show signs of strange afflictions.
Their movements became slow, their skin grew cold, and their eyes began to lose their shine. It was as if the curse had infected the very air, a disease that spread silently, but with deadly effect. At night, Beatrice would stand in the center of her grand bedroom, staring at the doll. She had placed it on a pedestal by the window, its tiny body staring back at her with lifeless eyes. It was as if the doll were mocking her, its dark magic still pulsing with the power she had commanded.
The threads were still there, each one a link in the chain that had bound Isabella and the others to their torment.
But now, with each passing day, Beatrice felt the weight of those threads. They were not just a tool of destruction.
They were a tether that seemed to be pulling her into the abyss along with her enemies.
The whispers had become almost unbearable. They filled her waking moments, dripped into her dreams like poison, and each time she closed her eyes, she saw Isabella, but not the Isabella she had known.
No, this was a different Isabella, pale, broken, and stretched impossibly thin. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, her eyes wide with horror. It was clear now. The magic was not just a force of vengeance.
It was a force that consumed.
It didn't just take, it claimed. Beatrice felt a strange, horrifying sensation creeping through her veins, a cold that seemed to settle deep inside her. She was no longer sure if it was the doll, or the curse, or something far darker that had begun to turn in her own soul.
She had made her choice, but had the curse, the very act of conjuring such power, also made its choice for her? The final straw came on the night of Isabella's last breath.
It was the end Beatrice had been waiting for, but it was not the victory she had anticipated. The night was thick with fog, the air damp and heavy with an unshakable tension. Beatrice had retired early, hoping to find rest, but sleep refused to come. Instead, she lay awake in the darkness, the shadows pressing in around her. The whispers were louder now, calling her name, urging her to finish it. Suddenly, there was a knock on her door. Startled, Beatrice rose from her bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She opened the door to find no one, but on the floor, in the doorway, was something strange, something she could not explain. It was a doll just like the one she had crafted for Isabella.
But this one was different.
It was not empty. The tiny, stitched face of the doll looked alive, its eyes too small, beady buttons seemed to glint in the moonlight, and as Beatrice reached down to pick it up, a chill ran through her spine. She felt it again. The tug, the pull, as if something had crossed the threshold of her own reality.
She turned and, for the briefest moment,
saw a figure standing in the doorway to the far room, the shape of a woman, pale and thin, her eyes wide with terror.
Beatrice's heart froze in her chest.
Isabella.
But it was impossible.
Isabella had died. The woman in the doorway was no longer Isabella, but something worse. The doll. The curse, it had taken her soul.
And now it was returning to claim more.
The realization hit Beatrice like a wave. The magic she had invoked, the power she had drawn upon, had not just cursed Isabella, it had cursed them all.
Every woman in the palace who had once sought power at her side. Every figure that had crossed her path. Every thread she had wound around the doors, each one was now a part of the curse.
And that curse, the dark force, had no intention of stopping. It was hungry.
It was endless. And as Beatrice stared into the hollow eyes of the doll, she understood.
The curse would never end.
It would never leave. It would consume everything. Years passed, or perhaps it was only days. Time had lost all meaning in Hollingsworth Manor.
The mansion that had once been the heart of aristocratic life was now a place of darkness, a forgotten relic of a past that had been swallowed by its own greed and ambition. The dolls still filled the rooms, more numerous now, their forms growing ever more grotesque with the passage of time.
They no longer resembled the women they had once been. Their faces were twisted, their limbs warped by the dark forces that had bound them. Some had begun to rot, their cloth bodies falling apart, their eyes glazed over with an emptiness that could never be filled. But still, they were there,
and they would remain.
Lady Beatrice Hollingsworth, now nothing more than a shadow of the woman she had once been, wandered the halls of her cursed palace, unable to escape the weight of her own creation.
Her soul was locked in the body of a doll, her thoughts scattered, her mind fractured.
And yet, she could still hear them, the whispers, the voices of the dolls, each one calling her name.
They never stopped. They never ceased. In the darkness, there was no end.
The curse had claimed her, and it would never let her go. Time lost its meaning in the forsaken halls of Hollingsworth Manor.
The years, the centuries, it was all a blur of shadows and decay.
The mansion had once been a testament to wealth and grandeur, but now it was nothing more than a mausoleum, its halls filled with the lifeless echoes of its past. The air was thick with dust, the windows blackened by years of neglect. No one had come to this place in years. It was a forgotten relic of the past, a place where the dead refused to stay dead. Lady Beatrice Hollingsworth, once the sharp, beautiful, and
commanding figure of aristocratic society, was now little more than a phantom in the halls she had once ruled. The curse she had brought had consumed her, turning her into something less than human, less than mortal. She had become one of the dolls, the very objects she had used to destroy her enemies, to rise above the others, to take her place at the top. Now she was one of them, trapped in an endless cycle of torment, her soul bound forever to the dark magic she had unleashed. She had no body, no form. She existed only as a presence, a whisper among the dolls, a flicker in the shadowy corners of the manor. She could feel them, all the other women who had fallen victim to her curse.
They too were trapped in the dolls they had once scorned. The voices of the trapped souls were a constant hum in her mind, cacophony
that darkness, in that suffocating silence, Beatrice's own voice joined the chorus.
She had tried once to escape to break free of the curse,
but she had no power left. The magic had bound her to this place, to the dolls, to the very walls of Hollingsworth Manor. She was now a part of it all. The mansion, though crumbling and decaying, seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as though the very foundation of the house was alive with the dark forces Beatrice had conjured. The dolls whispered, their tiny, cracked voices rising in the air like a wind through the trees.
They whispered her name, over and over again. Beatrice, and she listened.
They had once been rivals, once been enemies.
Now, they were her only companions in this place of eternal damnation.
The dolls, the souls, they were all that remained of the woman she had once been. They had been her enemies, her victims, but they were also her punishment.
The curse had not only stolen their lives, but it had stolen her own. And now, as she wandered the halls of the manor, she understood the true cost of the magic she had invoked. The dark magic had no mercy.
It took everything. It demanded everything. There was no reprieve, no release. The dolls, the trapped souls, would never be free, not unless the curse was broken. And the only way to break the curse was to unravel the very threads she had woven, a task that could never be completed. Beatrice had once been a woman of power, of influence, a woman who could bend others to her will with a glance, with a smile.
But now, all that remained of her was a presence, a shadow in the darkness.
The dolls, once her tools, had become the instruments of her undoing. The power she had sought, the vengeance she had craved, had consumed her body and soul. Each doll was a reminder of the cost of ambition.
They were not just vessels of dark magic. They were the broken pieces of Beatrice's soul. And as the years stretched on, as the manor crumbled and the dolls decayed, Beatrice found herself slipping further into the abyss.
The whispers of the dolls had become deafening, and their faces, twisted and grotesque, were now the only faces she could see.
The other souls, the ones who had once been her rivals, now had no form, no identity.
They were merely shadows, their voices lost to the ever-present dark. It was then, in the deepest corner of her madness, that Beatrice understood the full weight of her actions.
She had not just cursed her enemies, she had cursed herself. She had summoned the darkness, and in doing so, she had sealed her own fate. As the centuries stretched on, Hollingsworth Manor became a place of myth, a place of legend.
Those who dared to speak of it whispered only in hushed tones, and the house itself was left to rot in the countryside, forgotten by the world that had once been its domain. But the curse had not forgotten. It never forgot. The dolls remained, scattered throughout the manor.
Their faces, once lifelike, were now rotted and decayed.
Their clothing was tattered, their bodies crumbling under the weight of time.
But still, their eyes remained dark, glassy, unblinking, staring into the void. And in that void, Beatrice Hollingsworth remained, trapped within the curse she had created, a prisoner of her own ambition.
She had sought power,
she had sought revenge,
and in the end, she had found only a never-ending spiral of torment and regret. The manor was no longer a home. It was a tomb. The dolls her victims, her rivals, her own reflection remained in their places, forever frozen in time, forever imprisoned by the magic Beatrice had called forth. The legacy of Lady Beatrice Hollingsworth was not one of power or glory, but of darkness. The darkness that she had invited into the world, the darkness that had consumed her very soul. And so, as the wind howled through the cracked windows of the manor, the dolls whispered.
They whispered her name,
Beatrice, and in the silence that followed, there was no answer.
only the eternal hum of the curse, echoing through the decaying halls of a forgotten house, where once a woman had dared to reach too far and had paid the price.
As the passage of time dragged on, the legend of Lady Beatrice Hollingsworth faded from the world's collective memory.
Her name was nothing more than a ghost in the whispers of the past, her dark deeds buried under centuries of dust.
The mansion she had once ruled, once a beacon of aristocracy and grandeur, was now nothing more than a crumbling ruin. It was swallowed by the earth, overtaken by the wild thorns and roots of the forest that surrounded it.
Yet her curse had not died. Hollingsworth Manor, despite its ruinous state, still stood as a monument to a past drenched in dark power.
There were those who still ventured into the forest, drawn by the legends that surrounded the old mansion, those who dared to seek out the forgotten treasures of the manor or the forbidden knowledge hidden within its walls.
But none of them ever returned.
They would often come back with wild eyes, their minds shattered by what they had seen. Those who survived spoke of a presence of an unholy force that seemed to cling to the very stones of the house. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with a malignant energy, as if something was alive within them.
And in the corners of the rooms, among the shattered furniture and rotting beams, the dolls remained, their hollow eyes following every step. Beatrice's curse had woven itself into the fabric of the land.
The dolls, those grotesque, lifeless effigies, became more than just symbols of vengeance.
They became anchors binding the dark magic to the world.
They were the anchor points of an ancient ritual, one that was never completed. And so, with each new soul that ventured into the manor, the curse grew stronger. The dolls fed on their fear, their terror, trapping them in an endless cycle of torment, just as they had once trapped the souls of Beatrice's enemies.
The world moved on, indifferent to the cursed fate that awaited any who dared to trespass. But in the darkness of the manor, the curse lived on, never letting go. Beatrice, though long lost to the world, was never truly gone. Her spirit, her essence, was trapped in the very fabric of the curse. It was as though the manor itself had become an extension of her with her own personal prison, where the souls she had destroyed now drifted in and out of their doll-like prisons, waiting for the end that would never come. Years passed,
and then, one day, a visitor arrived.
She was young a scholar, a historian fascinated by the Victorian era. Her name was Eleanor Willoughby, and she had heard the rumours surrounding Hollingsworth Manor. Unlike most, she was not afraid.
She was drawn to the manor not by fear, but by curiosity.
The mystery of the manor, the story of Lady Beatrice Hollingsworth, the strange and dark allure of the dolls, it all beckoned her.
Eleanor had spent years researching the stories, the fragmented accounts that had survived through the ages. She had read the letters, the diaries, and the few scattered records that spoke of the terrible curse.
But she was not a woman of superstition.
She believed in knowledge, in history, and in the power of the human will to uncover the truth. The path leading to the manor was overgrown and nearly impassable, but Eleanor was determined.
She made her way through the woods, guided only by the faint traces of old, weathered maps. Her footsteps were steady, confident, though her heart raced with the anticipation of discovery.
By the time she reached the gates of Hollingsworth Manor, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving the landscape bathed in a pale, otherworldly glow. The mansion loomed before her, its decaying walls like the remnants of a forgotten dream.
It was a place that should have been left undisturbed, a place that should have been abandoned. But Eleanor felt only exhilaration.
She was about to uncover the secrets of the past, secrets that had long been shrouded in mystery. She stepped through the crumbling archway and into the manor's courtyard, her footsteps echoing against the cracked stone. As she made her way inside, she felt the weight of the silence press in around her.
The air was thick with dust, and the windows were soiled and broken, allowing only the faintest slivers of moonlight to filter into the gloom.
But the dolls, those twisted, silent figures, were everywhere. They were seated on shelves, arranged in grim formations eyes glistened in the faint light. Their stitched faces frozen in expressions of agony. They seemed to watch her every move.
Their presence unsettling. Though Eleanor refused to give in to fear, she moved deeper into the manor, into the heart of its long-forgotten rooms.
And that was when she saw in the doll.
It sat on a pedestal in the centre of the grand hall, placed carefully and intentionally, as though it were waiting for her. Its features were delicate, finely carved, but what struck her most were the eyes. They were unlike the others.
They were not glass.
They were dark, liquid, swirling with a depth that seemed to pull her in, as if they were staring into the very depths of her soul. Eleanor reached out toward it.
She hesitated for a moment, unsure, but then something, an impulse, a force compelled her to touch it. As her fingers brushed against the doll's cold, lifeless skin, she felt a strange shock run through her body. It was a pulse, like a heartbeat, a pulse that vibrated through the air, as if the very essence of the house was awakening. The ground beneath her seemed to shift, and the whispers, those faint, insistent whispers, began to grow louder. They spoke her name, and then, in a chilling moment of clarity, Eleanor realized the truth. She was not alone. She had never been alone. The curse was alive. The dolls, the whispers, the manor itself, they were all tied to Beatrice Hollingsworth's lingering will. Her thirst for power, her obsession with control, had infected this place, making it a prison, a trap for any who dared to enter. The souls of the women she had cursed, the women she had destroyed, had not been freed. They had been trapped in the dolls, bound by the same dark magic that had once consumed Beatrice herself. And now, Eleanor was just another victim, another soul that would become part of the curse. As the last of her breath left her body, her vision grew hazy, and the darkness of the manor swallowed her whole. Her figure, once alive and vibrant, became just another doll, a tiny, perfect replica of her, trapped forever in the twisted web of the curse that had begun so long ago. And in that final moment, as the echo of Eleanor's name faded into the shadows, the dolls, those lifeless figures, began to whisper once more. Beatrice, the curse would never end. The winds that had once howled through the manor's broken windows were silent now. The air was still, oppressive, like the calm before a storm. It had been centuries since the curse had first taken hold, since Beatrice had summoned the dark forces to destroy her enemies. Yet, despite the years that had passed, despite the countless souls that had been consumed, something was stirring again in the manor, something dangerous, something that had the potential to shatter the endless cycle. Deep within the manor, within the heart of the cursed halls, Beatrice's presence was stronger than ever. She was aware. Her senses stretched beyond the limits of time and space, and for the first time in years, she understood. She understood what she had done. She had not just created a curse. She had created a prison. But now, there was a shift. Beatrice's fractured spirit had reached a realization. The only way to end the curse was to confront it, to face the power that had once consumed her. The dolls, her victims, and her rivals, they had all been a part of her dark creation, but they were also the key to its undoing. The magic, the threads that bound them, could be unraveled, but only by the one who had woven them together. But what price would Beatrice have to pay? The power she had called upon had cost her everything. Would facing the curse, confronting the very force she had created, be enough to release her? To release the others? She did not know. But as the first light of dawn began to creep through the cracked windows, something shifted within the manor. The curse was at its peak, its power at its strongest, and within that moment of tension, Beatrice gathered every shred of her remaining will, every fragment of her fragmented soul, and began to reach out. The dolls stirred, the souls cried out, and for the briefest moment, the walls of Hollingsworth Manor groaned. as though something ancient was about to break. Could Beatrice undo what she had done? Could she stop the cycle of torment, release the trapped souls, and end the curse that had haunted her and him forever? In that moment, the manor held its breath, and then, as the final echoes of a long-forgotten past seemed to fade into the very walls of the mansion, the whispers fell silent. The cycle
had ended. The curse of Beatrice Hollingsworth and her cursed dolls has come to a close.
But in the quiet darkness of Hollingsworth Manor, questions still linger.
Could there be more?
What other dark forces remain trapped in the forgotten corners of the world?